The iron chains rattled against the wooden platform as thunder rolled across the New Mexico sky, and Thomas Reed felt his world narrow to a single impossible choice. Two identical faces stared back at him from the auction block, both belonging to Apache twin sisters who stood nearly 7 feet tall, their matching dark eyes burning with a defiance that made grown men step back in fear. The auctioneer's voice cut through the humid air like a whip, calling for bids on what he called a matched pair of savages, and Thomas watched as men who ran saloons and mining operations leaned forward with hunger in their eyes. His hand moved to the leather pouch at his belt, containing $73, everything he owned in the world after 3 years of breaking his back on other men's ranches. The gavel began its descent toward a final sale that would condemn these women to a fate worse than death, and Thomas heard his own voice shout a number that would either save 3 lives or destroy them all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Santa Rosa auction yard had seen its share of human misery, but nothing quite prepared the crowd for the sight of Nahla and Naya standing side by side on the seller's platform. They weren't just tall, they were magnificent in a way that made the term giant seem inadequate. Both women possessed the kind of raw, physical presence that suggested ancient warrior bloodlines, with broad shoulders that spoke of lives spent drawing war bows and carrying heavy burdens across unforgiving desert terrain. Their matching buckskin dresses, torn and stained from weeks of captivity, still carried the intricate beadwork that marked them as members of the Chiricahua band. Though most of the white settlers watching wouldn't have recognized the significance, what made the crowd truly uneasy wasn't just their size or their obvious Apache heritage. It was the way they moved in perfect synchronization, as if sharing a single consciousness between 2 bodies. When one shifted her weight, the other mirrored the movement exactly. When one's eyes tracked across the crowd, her twin's gaze followed the identical path a heartbeat later. Frontier settlers were superstitious people, and this uncanny coordination suggested something beyond the natural world, something that made even the boldest men make subtle signs against evil. Thomas Reed stood at the back of the crowd, having wandered into town that morning with no intention of attending a slave auction. He'd come to Santa Rosa looking for work, hoping that someone might need an extra hand for the cattle drive season. At 28 years old, he'd spent most of his adult life drifting from ranch to ranch, never staying long enough to put down roots, never earning enough to buy land of his own. His clothes were patched and faded, his boots held together more by hope than leather, and his hat had seen so many seasons that its original color was a matter of speculation. But poverty hadn't hardened his heart the way it did some men. Maybe it was because he'd grown up listening to his mother read from worn books about dignity and justice. Or maybe it was because he'd once watched his younger brother die from pneumonia, while a wealthy doctor refused to come to their cabin because the family couldn't pay in advance. Whatever the reason, Thomas Reed had developed a bone-deep hatred for watching the powerful crush the powerless. And this auction triggered every protective instinct he possessed. The auctioneer was a florid man named Silas Blackwood, known throughout the territory for his ability to sell anything to anyone. He wore a suit that had once been expensive, but now showed the wear of constant travel, and his voice carried the practiced enthusiasm of a carnival barker. "Gentlemen, what we have here is a rare opportunity," he announced, gesturing grandly at the twins. Apache women of exceptional size and strength, perfectly matched, capable of labor that would break 3 normal women. Imagine the work they could accomplish in your mines, your fields, he paused meaningfully, private establishments. The crowd's laughter had an ugly edge to it. Thomas felt his jaw clench as he watched several men elbow each other and make crude comments about what they'd do with a matched pair. The twins' expressions never changed, but Thomas noticed the slight tension in their shoulders, the way their hands flexed against their bonds. They understood enough English to know exactly what was being suggested. "We'll start the bidding at $50, Blackwood continued. "A bargain price for two specimens of this quality." "Do I hear 50? A man in a dirty canvas coat raised his hand. Thomas recognized him as Luther Brennan, who owned a silver mine 20 miles north of town. Brennan had a reputation for working his laborers to death and had been through 4 wives, all of whom had died under mysterious circumstances. The thought of these women ending up in his hands made Thomas's stomach turn. $50 to Mr. Brennan, the auctioneer acknowledged. "Do I hear 60? Another hand shot up. This one belonged to Cyrus Marsh, who ran a brothel disguised as a boarding house on the edge of town. Marsh's establishments across 3 territories were known for their brutality, places where women who entered rarely left alive. His smile as he bid was the smile of a predator who'd already decided how to devour his prey. The bidding climbed steadily. $70, $80, $90. Thomas watched in growing horror as the price rose beyond what he could possibly match. His entire life savings amounted to $73, money he'd scraped together over 3 years by living on nothing, sleeping in barns, and taking the jobs no one else wanted. It was supposed to be the foundation for buying a small piece of land, for finally having something that belonged to him. But as he watched the twins standing with their heads held high, despite everything being done to them, Thomas realized that some things mattered more than personal dreams. His mother had always said that character was defined by what you did when doing the right thing cost you everything. He'd never fully understood what she meant until this moment. $100, Marsh called out, his voice confident. The crowd murmured appreciatively. It was a substantial sum for 2 captives, even ones as unusual as these. $100 to Mr. Marsh, Blackwood announced. Going once. Thomas's hand moved before his brain could stop it, and his voice cut across the yard with surprising strength. $120. Every head in the crowd turned to stare at him. Blackwood's eyebrows rose in surprise. Marsh's expression darkened with anger at being challenged by what looked like a saddle tramp with nothing to his name. Even the twins turned their heads in perfect unison to look at the stranger who'd just entered the bidding. "Well, well," Blackwood said, recovering his showman's enthusiasm. "We have a new bidder. $120 from the gentleman in the back." "Do I hear 130? Marsh's hand rose immediately. 130. Thomas felt sweat break out on his forehead. He didn't have $130. He didn't even have 120. But he'd committed now, and he couldn't let these women fall into Marsh's hands. His mind raced, calculating what he owned that he could sell. His horse may be worth $40. His saddle, another 15. His father's rifle, probably 25 if he found the right buyer. His mother's silver locket, the last thing he had of her. He couldn't even think about what that might bring. $150. Thomas called out, his voice steadier than he felt. The crowd gasped. That was serious money, more than most men in the territory earned in 6 months of hard labor. Marsh stood up from where he'd been sitting, his face flushed with anger. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. "Just a man with money to spend," Thomas replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. He'd learned long ago that showing weakness invited attack, and Marsh was the kind of predator who fed on fear. $150, Blackwood repeated, clearly delighted by the unexpected drama. "Going once, going twice. $200, Marsh snarled. He wasn't going to let some nobody embarrass him in front of the entire town. Thomas felt his heart sink. There was no way he could match that bid. Not even if he sold everything he owned twice over. He'd played his hand and lost, and now these women would suffer even more because he'd driven up the price and wounded Marsh's pride in the process. But then something unexpected happened. Mahala, the twin on the left, or was it Naya? Thomas couldn't tell them apart, spoke for the first time. Her voice was clear and strong, cutting through the crowd's noise with surprising authority. "Apache law says captive can choose death over dishonor," she said in English that was heavily accented but perfectly understandable. "You sell us to that man," She nodded toward Marsh. "We choose death. We will find way to die before he touches us. You get no work, no profit, nothing but 2 dead bodies to explain to the law." The crowd fell silent. Frontier settlers might not respect Apache rights, but they understood threats, and this was delivered with absolute conviction. Both twins stood straighter, their expressions making it clear this wasn't a bluff. They would indeed choose death over certain fates, and everyone present believed it. Marsh's face went purple with rage. "You threatening me, you savage bitch?" "Duh!" "Not threat," the other twin said, her voice identical to her sister's. "Promise. Apache warriors know many ways to die. Some very fast, some very messy. You want to buy 2 corpses for $200. You go ahead." Blackwood looked genuinely troubled for the first time. Dead merchandise had no value, and having 2 Apache women die in Santa Rosa would bring unwanted attention from the army and possibly from Apache war parties seeking revenge. This auction was suddenly becoming much more complicated than he'd anticipated. "Now, ladies," he began in a placating tone, "let's not be hasty. $250, a new voice cut in. Everyone turned to see Judge Harold Winters standing at the edge of the crowd. The judge was a complicated figure in Santa Rosa, known for being relatively fair by frontier standards, but also for never letting morality interfere with profitable business. "I'll take them off your hands, Silas, and I guarantee they'll be treated within the bounds of civilized conduct." Thomas knew what that meant. The judge wouldn't brutalize them directly, but he'd work them to exhaustion on his large estate and rent them out to others for additional profit. It was a slower death than Marsh offered, but death nonetheless. The problem was, Thomas literally didn't have $250. He didn't even have half that amount. He'd made his grand gesture, but the cold mathematics of reality were about to crush him. The gavel was rising for the final time, and there was nothing he could do about it. Then Nala spoke again, this time directly to Thomas. "You poor cowboy and back. Why you bid on us?" Thomas was caught off guard by the direct question. "Because it's wrong," he said simply. "Because you're people, not property, and because I'd want someone to help me if I was up there instead of you." The twins looked at each other, and something passed between them that Thomas couldn't interpret. It was as if they were having an entire conversation without words, making decisions that would affect all their fates. When they turned back to face the crowd, their expressions had changed subtly. They were no longer just defiant captives. They were strategists who'd just found an unexpected advantage. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Apache law also says debt of life belongs to Savior," Naya said clearly. "This poor cowboy only one who bids with honor, not with plans for rape and murder. He shows courage even though he has no wealth. Such man is worthy of Apache respect. Therefore," Nala continued, the twins' voices overlapping in an eerie harmony, "we declare life debt to Thomas Reed. By Apache law, if he buys us, we are bound to protect and serve him until debt is repaid. If anyone else buys us, we choose death immediately. This is our final word." The crowd erupted in confused conversation. What the twins had just done was clever beyond measure. They'd transformed themselves from valuable merchandise into a liability that only one specific buyer could safely purchase. If anyone else won the auction, they'd effectively be buying 2 women who would kill themselves at the first opportunity. But if Thomas bought them, they'd be bound by their own cultural laws to serve him faithfully. Blackwood looked ready to tear his hair out. Marsh was shouting threats about what he'd do to uppity savages, and Judge Winters was shaking his head and withdrawing from the bidding. The auction had descended into chaos, and at the center of it all stood Thomas Reed, a broke cowboy who'd just been maneuvered into a position where he was the only viable buyer. "This is highly irregular," Blackwood sputtered. "I can't guarantee—" "You can guarantee you'll have 2 dead women on your hands if you don't accept the poor cowboy's bid," Nahla interrupted. "We have spoken. Apache word is iron. We do not change what we have said." Blackwood looked around at the crowd, seeing nothing but trouble no matter what he decided. Finally, he sighed in defeat. "Fine. The lot goes to Thomas Reed for $150. But, Mr. Reed, you better have that money or we're going to have serious problems." Thomas's mind was spinning. He had $73 in his pouch. He owned a horse worth maybe $40 if he found a generous buyer. His saddle might bring 15. His rifle was quality enough for 25. That put him at $153 if everything sold for optimistic prices. But he'd be left with literally nothing. No horse, no saddle, no weapon, no savings. He'd be more destitute than the day he was born. But those two sets of dark eyes were watching him with something that looked almost like hope. And Thomas Reed had never been able to walk away from hope. "I need an hour," he said. "Give me 1 hour to raise the money and I'll pay in full." Blackwood consulted his pocket watch theatrically. "You have until 3 o'clock, Mr. Reed. If you don't have my money by then, these ladies go to the next highest bidder, consequences be damned." The next 57 minutes were the most frantic of Thomas's life. He ran to the livery stable and found a buyer for his horse, a sturdy mare named Daisy, who'd carried him faithfully for 2 years. The stable owner sensed desperation and offered $35. Thomas didn't have time to negotiate. He sold his saddle to a passing cowboy for $12, his rifle to a merchant for $22, and his camping gear for $3 to a young homesteader heading west. That brought him to $145. He was still $5 short, and he had nothing left to sell except the clothes on his back and his mother's locket. The locket was silver, delicately engraved with roses, and contained a tiny portrait of his mother painted when she was young. She'd given it to him on her deathbed, making him promise to keep it always as a reminder of where he came from. Thomas stood in the middle of Santa Rosa's main street, holding the locket in his palm and feeling the weight of impossible choices. $5, that's all he needed. $5 stood between those women and hell, between doing the right thing and walking away with at least one precious thing in his possession. His mother's voice echoed in his memory. "Character is defined by what you do when doing the right thing costs you everything." Thomas walked into the jeweler's shop and emerged 3 minutes later with $5 in his hand and nothing but the clothes he wore. He'd sold his past to buy someone else's future, and he had no idea if it was the stupidest decision he'd ever made or the only one he could live with. When he walked back into the auction yard at 2:58, Blackwood looked genuinely surprised to see him. Thomas counted out $150 in various bills and coins, laying them on the auctioneer's table with hands that trembled slightly from exhaustion and emotion. Blackwood counted the money twice, then nodded. "Paid in full. They're yours, Mr. Reed. May God have mercy on your soul for whatever you're planning." Thomas approached the platform where the twins still stood in their chains. Up close, they were even more imposing than they'd appeared from a distance. Both women had the kind of sculpted features that came from generations of harsh survival, with high cheekbones, strong jaws, and dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's core. Their skin was the color of burnished copper, and despite weeks of captivity, they radiated a dangerous vitality that made Thomas understand why the crowd had been afraid. "I'm Thomas Reed," he said quietly, pulling the key from his pocket that Blackwood had given him. "I'm going to take off these chains now. After that, you're free to go wherever you want. I didn't buy you to own you. I bought you to set you free." The twins watched him unlock their shackles without speaking. When the chains finally fell away, they both rubbed their wrists where the metal had chafed the skin raw. For a long moment, they simply stood there, and Thomas wondered if they were about to walk away without another word. Then Nala spoke, her voice low enough that only the 3 of them could hear. "You gave everything for us. We saw you sell your horse, your weapons, everything you owned. Why would a poor cowboy do this for strangers?" Thomas shrugged, suddenly feeling embarrassed by the intensity of their attention. "Seemed like the right thing to do. Besides, You gave me no choice with that clever trick about the life debt. You backed everyone into a corner where I was the only safe option." Naya's lips curved into the slightest smile. "We are not sorry for our cleverness. Apache must be smart to survive. But you are right, we did manipulate the situation. What we said about life debt, though, that was truth. By our laws and our honor, we belong to you now until the debt is repaid. I don't want anyone belonging to me," Thomas protested. "Just take your freedom and find your people. That's all I wanted to give you." The twins exchanged another of their wordless communications, and then both of them stepped closer to Thomas. At nearly 7 feet tall, they towered over his own 6-foot frame, and he had to tilt his head back slightly to meet their eyes. "Our village was destroyed 3 months ago," Nala said. "Our people are scattered across the desert, hiding in small groups, hunted by cavalry and settlers. We have nowhere to go, no family left alive that we know of. You speak of freedom, but freedom to what? To starve alone in the wilderness. To be captured again by men worse than the ones you saved us from." "Then I'll help you find your people," Thomas offered. "I don't have much," he laughed bitterly. "Actually, I don't have anything at all anymore, but I can work, earn money, help you get supplies for the journey." "No," Naya said firmly. "We have declared life debt. This is sacred to Apache. We stay with you, protect you, work beside you until we have repaid what you gave for us. This is not negotiable. This is honor." Thomas looked from one twin to the other, seeing the absolute determination in their matching expressions. He'd just spent his last cent, sold everything he owned, and apparently acquired 2 7-foot-tall Apache bodyguards who considered themselves honor-bound to follow him around. His life had taken a turn into the surreal, and he had no idea what came next. "I don't even have a place to live," he admitted. "I was planning to find work on a ranch, sleep in a bunkhouse, save up for my own land someday. That was before I got myself into this situation. Then we find work together," Nakhla said practically. 3 workers are worth more than 1. We are strong, we learn fast, and we fear no labor. Someone will hire us." As the 3 of them walked out of the auction yard together, the broke cowboy and the twin Apache giants, Thomas caught sight of Cyrus Marsh watching from across the street. The brothel owner's expression promised future trouble, but Thomas was too overwhelmed by his current situation to worry about threats that hadn't materialized yet. What he didn't know was that by sunset, news of the unusual auction would spread across the territory, drawing attention from people both friendly and hostile. He didn't know that the twins' mysterious connection went far deeper than simple sisterhood, or that their presence would unlock abilities and knowledge he never suspected existed. And he certainly didn't know that 3 lives converging in a dusty New Mexico auction yard would set in motion events that would challenge everything the frontier believed about civilization, savagery, and where the line between them really lay. For now, all Thomas knew was that he'd done something either incredibly noble or incredibly stupid, and he'd find out which in the days to come. The sun was setting over Santa Rosa when Thomas found himself sitting on a wooden bench outside the general store, flanked by 2 Apache twins who attracted stares from every passing citizen. His stomach growled with a hunger he couldn't afford to satisfy, and the reality of his situation was beginning to sink in with uncomfortable clarity. He'd given away everything for a principle, and principles didn't fill empty bellies or provide shelter when the desert night turned cold. Nakhla noticed his discomfort immediately. "You have not eaten today," she observed. It wasn't a question. Thomas shrugged, trying to appear unconcerned. "I'll manage. Not the first time I've skipped meals." "That is foolish," Naya said bluntly. "A man cannot work if he does not eat. We cannot protect a protector who weakens himself through pride." She reached into a small pouch at her waist and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. "Pemmican. Apache trail food. It will sustain you." Thomas wanted to refuse out of pride, but the practical part of his mind recognized the absurdity of starving when food was offered. He accepted the dried meat mixture and bit into it, finding it surprisingly palatable despite its rough appearance. As he ate, the twins settled into a comfortable silence, and Thomas found himself studying them more carefully in the fading light. They were identical in every physical aspect he could discern. Same height, same build, same features down to a small scar on their left cheekbones. But there were subtle differences in their mannerisms. Nala's gaze was constantly moving, scanning the environment like a scout watching for danger. Naya's attention was more focused, her eyes lingering on details, analyzing rather than simply observing. It was like watching two halves of a complete tactical mind operating in perfect coordination. "You said your village was destroyed," Thomas said carefully, unsure if the topic was too painful, but needing to understand who these women were. "What happened?" The twins exchanged one of their wordless looks, and Thomas wondered if they were deciding how much to trust him. Finally, Nala spoke, her voice taking on the cadence of someone recounting events that had been replayed in memory countless times. "We are from the Copper Canyon Band, a small group of Chiricahua who lived in the mountains north of here. Our mother was a healer, our father a war chief who believed in finding peace with the white settlers." Her expression grew distant. He thought if we stayed in our traditional lands and did not raid, the settlers would leave us alone. He was wrong. Naya picked up the story seamlessly, as if they were telling it with one voice, divided between two bodies. 3 months ago, a group of miners came to our canyon. They claimed they had rights to dig there, that some paper from the government said the land was theirs now. Our father tried to negotiate, to show them that we had lived there for generations, that the canyon held sacred sites of our ancestors. The miners did not care about sacred sites, Nahla continued. They wanted the copper in the rocks, the silver in the streams. When our father refused to leave, they went to the cavalry and told lies. They said we had been raiding settlements, killing travelers, stealing livestock. None of it was true, but the cavalry believed the miners because white men always believe other white men. Thomas listened with growing horror, recognizing a pattern he'd seen repeated across the frontier. Land that became valuable suddenly stopped belonging to the people who'd lived there for centuries, and legal documents signed in distant offices carried more weight than generations of occupation. "The cavalry came at dawn," Naya said, her voice dropping lower. "We had warning from scouts, but not enough time. Our father went out to meet them with a white flag, to talk and explain that we were peaceful. They shot him before he could say 10 words. Then they attacked," Nala finished. "They burned the lodges, shot anyone who resisted, rounded up those who surrendered. Our mother tried to shield the children. She died with 3 of them in her arms. We fought, killed 4 soldiers before they overwhelmed us with numbers. They would have killed us too, but their officer saw how tall we were, how strong. He saw profit instead of threat." The twins fell silent, and Thomas saw tears tracking down both their faces in identical paths. They made no sound as they wept, no sobbing or gasping, just silent tears for losses too deep for words. He wanted to say something comforting, but every phrase that came to mind felt inadequate against the magnitude of their grief. "The officer sold us to a trader who specialized in exotic merchandise," Naya eventually continued, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "We spent 6 weeks in a cage, being transported from town to town, displayed like circus animals. The trader had plans to take us east, to sell us to wealthy men who collected unusual people as if we were art pieces or rare animals. But his wagon broke down near Santa Rosa," Nala added. "He decided to sell us quickly rather than pay for repairs. That is how we ended up on the auction block, and that is how we met you, Thomas Reed." The use of his full name caught Thomas's attention. "How did you know my name during the auction?" he asked. "I never introduced myself." Both twins smiled slightly, and for the first time Thomas saw something other than pain in their expressions. "We heard you asking the stable master about work," Naya explained. "Before the auction started, when you first arrived in town. We were being held in a wagon nearby, and Apache warriors are trained from childhood to listen and observe. We heard you tell him your name, Heard you say you were looking for honest work. Heard the sadness in your voice when you spoke of having no home to return to. We also heard you defend an Apache boy who was being harassed by drunk settlers, Nala added. You did not know we could hear, but we listened to you tell those men that the boy had done nothing wrong, that cruelty toward children was the mark of cowards, not men. That is when we first thought, this one is different. Thomas felt embarrassed by their praise. I just said what was right. Anyone decent would have done the same. No, both twins said simultaneously, their voices overlapping in that eerie harmony. Most men would have walked past. Most men would have laughed along with the bullies. Most men would have seen an Apache child and thought savage rather than boy. You saw a child in need of defending. That told us who you truly are. The conversation was interrupted by the approach of a heavy-set man in a sheriff's badge. Thomas recognized him as Monroe Dalton, Santa Rosa's lawman, and a man with a reputation for favoring whoever paid him best. The sheriff's eyes swept over the three of them with obvious disapproval. "Read," Dalton said without preamble. "You caused quite a stir today with your auction performance. Got people talking, asking questions about what you're planning to do with these two." "I'm planning to help them find honest work, same as I'm looking for," Thomas replied evenly. "Nothing illegal about that. Maybe not illegal, but definitely unusual. See, thing is, we've got citizens concerned about having two Apache warriors loose in town. Folks remember what happened to the Henderson family last spring when raiders came through. Women and children killed, homestead burned. People are nervous." Thomas stood up slowly, aware that he was at a disadvantage without a weapon. These women had nothing to do with any raids. They were victims, not perpetrators. I have a bill of sale that says they're free to go where they please, and unless you've got charges to bring, I'd appreciate you leaving us alone." Dalton's expression hardened. "Watch your tone, boy. I'm trying to help you here. There's talk of running you all out of town before trouble starts. Now, if you were smart, you'd take these Indians back to their people and get yourself out of a situation that's only going to end badly." "We have no people to return to," Nahla said quietly. "Our band is scattered, our family dead. We have declared life debt to Thomas Reed, and we will not leave him." The sheriff's hand moved toward his gun, a gesture that wasn't quite a threat but carried unmistakable menace. "That sounds mighty convenient for a drifter looking to start trouble. Some folks might think you're planning to use these women as weapons against decent citizens. The only weapon I'm interested in is honest work," Thomas shot back. "But if decent citizens want to judge people based on their heritage rather than their actions, then maybe we've got different definitions of what decent means." Dalton stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low growl. "I know your type, Reed. Self-righteous drifter who thinks he's better than everyone else. You come into town with nothing, make a scene at a public auction, and now you're walking around with two savages who could snap a man's neck without breaking a sweat. You're a liability, and liabilities have a way of disappearing in the desert where nobody asks questions." Before Thomas could respond, both twins stood up in perfect synchronization. They didn't make any threatening moves, didn't reach for weapons or adopt fighting stances. They simply rose to their full height and looked down at the sheriff with expressions that suggested he might want to reconsider his approach. "We understand your concern, Sheriff," Naya said with exaggerated politeness. "But you should understand something about Apache warriors. We are trained to read men like others read books. We see the corruption in your eyes, smell the whiskey on your breath, even though you are supposed to be working, notice the bulge in your pocket that suggests someone paid you to harass us. We also notice," Nala continued in the same unnervingly calm tone, "that you wear your gun on the right but favor your left hand. That means you are slow to draw, slow to aim, slow to fire. We could disarm you in 3 moves and leave you unconscious in the street before you touched your weapon. We do not do this because we are peaceful people who follow the law. But please do not mistake peace for weakness." The sheriff's face went pale, then red with fury. But he was also smart enough to recognize a credible threat when he heard one. Without another word, he turned and stalked away, his hand never quite reaching his gun. Thomas let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. You two just made a dangerous enemy. We made him before we spoke, Naya replied. Men like that hate anyone they cannot control or intimidate. He would have been our enemy regardless of what we said or did. As night fell completely over Santa Rosa, Thomas faced another practical problem. He had no money for a hotel room, no bedroll to sleep in the open, and no idea where 3 people with no resources could safely spend the night. The twins seemed to read his thoughts again. There is a stable at the edge of town, Nala said. The owner left for the evening. We saw him lock up and walk toward the saloon. Apache can open such locks without breaking them. We sleep there, leave before dawn, and no one knows we were present. Thomas hesitated. That's trespassing, maybe breaking and entering. Would you prefer to sleep in the street where Sheriff Dalton's friends might find us vulnerable? Naya asked practically. Or perhaps you think we should knock on doors and ask if any citizens of Santa Rosa would like to shelter a poor cowboy and 2 Apache giants. Sometimes survival requires bending rules that were made by people who never expected to be in our situation. She had a point, much as Thomas hated to admit it. Principles were important, but freezing to death in defense of property laws seemed like a poor way to honor the sacrifices he'd already made. They made their way to the stable under cover of darkness, and true to her word, Nala had the lock open in under a minute, using what looked like 2 pieces of bent wire. Inside, the stable smelled of hay and horses, with enough animal warmth to keep the night chill at bay. Thomas found an empty stall and was preparing to settle in when he noticed the twins were both staring at him with identical, intense expressions that made him suddenly nervous. What? He asked. We need to speak plainly, Nala said. About what comes next, about expectations, about the nature of the debt we owe you. Thomas felt a knot form in his stomach. I told you I don't expect anything. You're free to— Stop, Naya interrupted. You keep saying we are free, but you do not understand what that means to us. Among our people, life debt is sacred. You gave everything for us, your wealth, your security, your future. Such sacrifice creates a bond that cannot be dismissed with words about freedom. We are bound to you by honor, by choice, by something deeper than you yet understand. Both twins moved closer, and Thomas found himself backing against the stable wall. They weren't threatening exactly, but their presence was overwhelming in the confined space. In the dim light, filtering through the stable's cracks, their faces were shadows and highlights, identical expressions of something he couldn't quite name. Among Apache, Nahla said softly, twins are considered blessed by the spirits. We are not just 2 sisters who look alike. We share one soul divided between 2 bodies. What one feels, the other knows. What one thinks, the other understands. We are separate people, but also one being. This is difficult for outsiders to comprehend. And because we are one soul in 2 bodies, Naya continued, we make decisions together, we move together, She hesitated, searching for the right words in English. We love together. When one of us chooses a partner, both choose. When one gives her heart, both hearts are given. This is our nature, our gift, our burden. Thomas's heart was pounding now, understanding beginning to dawn about where this conversation was heading. I saved you because it was right, not because I expected anything in return. We know, both twins said together. That is why we choose you. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Thomas wasn't sure he was ready to face. He was exhausted, overwhelmed, and trying to process emotions and situations far outside his experience. These women were strangers, members of a culture he barely understood, bound to him by debts and obligations he'd never sought. But they were also brave, intelligent, and looking at him with expressions that held vulnerability beneath their warrior's strength. They'd lost everything just as he had. They were alone in a hostile world just as he was. And they were offering something he couldn't quite define, but felt in the marrow of his bones, a connection that went beyond simple gratitude or obligation. I don't know what to say, Thomas admitted quietly. Say nothing tonight, Nala replied gently. Sleep, rest, let your mind settle. Tomorrow we find work, We begin to build something from the ashes of what we all lost. But know this, Thomas Reed, we have chosen you as you chose us. What that means, we will discover together, as Thomas lay in the hay that night, listening to the quiet breathing of the twins in the darkness nearby. He realized his life had changed in ways he couldn't begin to comprehend. He'd walked into Santa Rosa as a broke cowboy looking for work. He was leaving as something entirely different, partner, protector, and possibly something more to two Apache warriors who saw in him something he'd never seen in himself. The future was uncertain, dangerous, and probably full of trouble. But for the first time since his mother's death, Thomas Reed didn't feel completely alone in facing it. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And perhaps that was worth more than all the money he'd given away. Dawn broke cold and gray over the New Mexico desert, and Thomas woke to find both twins already awake and preparing for the day. They'd somehow procured water and were braiding each other's hair with practiced efficiency. Their movements so synchronized it looked like watching a mirror image come to life. When they noticed he was awake, Nala offered him a canteen without comment. "We leave before the stable owner returns," Naya said quietly. "Apache do not steal, but we also do not advertise where we sleep when in enemy territory." Thomas splashed water on his face and tried to shake off the strange dreams that had plagued him through the night. Visions of two voices speaking as one, of hands reaching for him in darkness, of choices that seemed to carry weight beyond anything he understood. The twins watched him with knowing expressions that suggested they somehow knew exactly what he'd been dreaming about. They slipped out of the stable as the town was just beginning to stir, moving through back alleys with the twins leading the way. Despite their height making them conspicuous in open spaces, they demonstrated an uncanny ability to use shadows and angles to minimize their visibility. Thomas found himself following their lead instinctively, recognizing expertise when he saw it. "Where are we going?" he asked as they headed east toward the edge of town. "To find the only man in Santa Rosa who might hire 3 people that everyone else fears," Nala replied. "Clayton Burke. He owns the largest ranch in the territory, and he has a reputation for judging workers by their ability rather than their appearance." Thomas knew the name. Burke Ranch sprawled across 15,000 acres and ran cattle operations that supplied beef to army forts and mining camps throughout the region. Clayton Burke himself was a legend, a former Union officer who'd come west after the war and built an empire through sheer determination and ruthless business sense. He was known for being fair but demanding, and his ranch hands were among the best paid and hardest working in the territory. They reached the ranch by mid-morning, having walked 6 miles through terrain that would have exhausted most people. Thomas noticed that neither twin showed any sign of fatigue, their breathing steady and their pace never faltering. He'd grown up doing ranch work and considered himself fit, but these women operated on an entirely different level of physical conditioning. The Burke Ranch headquarters was impressive, a sprawling adobe compound with multiple barns, corrals filled with quality horses, and a main house that spoke of wealth earned through success rather than inheritance. Ranch hands moved with purposeful efficiency, and Thomas counted at least 20 men working various tasks around the property. A foreman spotted them approaching and rode over, his hand resting casually on his rifle in a gesture that wasn't quite threatening, but sent a clear message about being ready for trouble. He was a weathered man in his 50s, with eyes that had seen too much to be easily surprised. "Help you folks?" he asked, his gaze moving from Thomas to the twins and back again. "Looking for work," Thomas said directly. "All 3 of us. We're experienced with cattle, horses, and whatever else needs doing. We're willing to prove ourselves before you commit to hiring." The foreman's eyebrows rose. "You're the one who bought those 2 at auction yesterday. Word travels fast in these parts. You caused quite a stir, Reed. Didn't mean to cause anything except doing right by 2 people who deserved better than what they were getting." "Noble sentiment," the foreman replied. But nobility doesn't necessarily translate to ranch work. I'm Ben Cooper, head foreman here. Mr. Burke makes the final decisions on hiring, but I can tell you right now, we don't typically employ—" He paused delicately. "Apache workers. Not because of prejudice, you understand, but because it brings complications we don't need." "What kind of complications?" Naya asked, her English clear and her tone challenging without being disrespectful. "The complication of workers who can track a stray calf through rock terrain that would lose your best scouts. The complication of people who can read weather patterns 3 days in advance and know when to move herds to shelter. Or perhaps the complication of having women who can work as hard as any 3 of your current hands." Cooper's expression shifted from dismissive to intrigued. "That's quite a claim, miss." "It is not a claim," Nahla said. "It is a promise. Give us one task, any task your best men struggle with. If we cannot complete it better and faster, we will leave and never return. If we succeed, you hire all 3 of us at standard wages, with no special considerations or complications." The foreman studied them for a long moment, then smiled slowly. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. Wait here." He rode toward the main house and returned 10 minutes later with Clayton Burke himself. The rancher was a tall man in his early 50s, with iron-gray hair and the erect posture of someone who'd spent years in military uniform. His face was weathered but intelligent, his eyes sharp and assessing. "Cooper tells me you're making bold promises about your capabilities," Burke said without preamble. "I admire confidence, but I don't have time for braggarts who can't deliver. However, I do believe in testing claims before dismissing them. Are you familiar with the concept of wild Mustang capture?" Thomas nodded cautiously. Wild horses were notoriously difficult to catch, requiring tracking skills, patience, and the ability to anticipate animal behavior patterns. It was dangerous work that often took weeks to accomplish. "I've got a stallion that's been raiding my breeding mares for 3 months, Burke continued. "Black as midnight, smart as the devil, and too fast for any of my men to get a rope on. He's cost me 5 foals this season by driving off my studs and disrupting the herd. I've had 6 experienced hands trying to catch him for the past month. They've gotten close twice, but never close enough." "You want us to catch this horse?" Thomas asked. "I want those 2 to catch him," Burke corrected, nodding toward the twins. "You can tag along if you like, but I want to see what Apache tracking and hunting skills look like applied to ranch problems. You've got until sunset. Bring me that stallion alive and unharmed, and I'll hire all 3 of you at top wages. Fail, and I never want to see you on my property again." The twins exchanged one of their silent communications, then both nodded. "We accept," they said in unison. Burke provided them with basic supplies, rope, a canteen, and directions to where the stallion had last been spotted. Then he surprised Thomas by handing him a rifle. "Take this. That horse runs through cougar territory, and I won't have deaths on my conscience even if you do fail the test." As they set out toward the rocky highlands where the Mustang made his home, Thomas felt completely out of his depth. He knew basic tracking, but nothing that would help catch a horse that had evaded expert handlers for months. The twins, however, moved with absolute confidence. "You have doubts," Nala observed as they climbed a steep trail. "I have realistic concerns about attempting the impossible," Thomas corrected. "That stallion has outsmarted professional Mustang catchers." "What makes you think we can do better?" Naya smiled. "Because your professional catchers think like men trying to dominate an animal. We think like hunters trying to understand a brother. There is a difference." They reached a plateau overlooking a valley filled with scrub brush and scattered water sources. The twins immediately split up without discussing strategy, each moving to opposite sides of the high ground and beginning to scan the terrain below. Thomas stayed in the middle, feeling useless but trying to learn by observation. After 20 minutes, Nala gave a low whistle, a sound so perfectly mimicking a desert bird that Thomas almost missed it as a signal. Naya responded with an identical call from her position. Then both twins began working their way down into the valley, and Thomas hurried to keep up. "There," Nakhla said, pointing to tracks in sandy soil between 2 rocks. "Made this morning, probably within 2 hours. He came here to drink, then moved east toward the canyon. "He favors his right rear leg slightly," Naya added, studying the impressions. "Old injury healed, but leaving him with a preference for certain terrain. He will avoid steep downhill slopes on his right side." They followed the trail with a speed that left Thomas breathless. The twins moved through the landscape like water flowing downhill, taking the path of least resistance, but never slowing. They read signs Thomas couldn't even see, a disturbed pebble here, a bent grass blade there, the angle of a hoofprint that told them which direction the horse had been looking when he paused. 2 hours into the hunt, they found the stallion. He was magnificent, exactly as Burke had described, black coat gleaming in the sun, powerful muscles rippling under healthy flesh, and eyes that held intelligence bordering on uncanny. When he spotted them, he didn't bolt immediately. Instead, he watched them with what looked like curiosity. "He is testing us," Nahla whispered, "deciding if we are threats or merely annoyances. If we chase, he runs and wins. If we wait, we lose time. So we speak his language," Naya said. She stepped forward slowly, her hands empty and visible, and began making sounds Thomas had never heard before, a combination of clicks, low whistles, and humming that seemed to shift pitch in complex patterns. The stallion's ears swiveled forward, focusing on the sounds. He took a step closer, then another. Nahla joined her sister, and both twins began the strange vocalization together, their voices harmonizing in ways that seemed to bypass Thomas's ears and speak directly to something deeper in his consciousness. The horse walked closer, drawn by something in that sound that Thomas couldn't comprehend. When he was within 20 feet, both twins simultaneously sat down on the ground, making themselves smaller and less threatening. The stallion approached to within 10 feet, then 5, his nostrils flaring as he took in their scent. Naya slowly extended her hand, palm up, and continued the humming vocalization. The horse stretched his neck and sniffed her fingers. Then, incredibly, he lowered his head and allowed her to touch his muzzle. Over the next hour, Thomas watched something that looked more like magic than horse training. The twins worked in perfect coordination, taking turns approaching the stallion, touching him, gaining his trust through sounds and movements that seemed to come from knowledge far older than any written text. When Nala finally slipped a rope around his neck, the horse didn't resist. He simply followed her as if they'd been partners for years rather than minutes. They returned to Burke Ranch 3 hours before sunset, leading the black stallion who walked calmly between the twins, like he'd been barn-raised rather than wild-caught. Every ranch hand stopped working to stare at the impossible sight. Clayton Burke emerged from his house, looked at the stallion, then at the twins, then back at the horse. "I'll be damned," he said finally. "Cooper, you seeing what I'm seeing?" "Yes, sir, Mr. Burke. That's definitely the devil horse that's been causing us grief." Burke walked around the stallion, examining him carefully. Not a mark on him. Not stressed, not injured, not traumatized. "It's like he just decided to come home." He turned to the twins. "How?" "We asked him nicely," Naya said with the faintest hint of a smile. Burke laughed, a genuine sound of surprised delight. "Asked him nicely, right. Well, a deal's a deal. All 3 of you are hired at standard wages, which is $35 a month plus room and board. You'll bunk in the main compound, eat with the crew, and follow Cooper's orders unless I countermand them. Questions?" "Just one," Thomas said. "Why?" "You could have rejected us like everyone else. Why give us a chance?" Burke's expression grew serious. "Because 20 years ago, I was a young officer who learned that courage and capability have nothing to do with the color of a man's skin or where he was born. I fought alongside men from every background imaginable, and the ones who saved my life more times than I can count were the ones other officers wanted to dismiss as inferior. I swore then that if I ever had the power to judge people by their actions instead of their appearance, I would. Today you 3 proved your worth. That's all that matters to me." The next 3 weeks fell into a rhythm that surprised everyone, including the other ranch hands. The twins proved to be extraordinary workers, capable of tasks that seemed impossible for their size or gender. They could gentle wild horses, track lost cattle through terrain that baffled experienced scouts, and predict weather changes with accuracy that saved the ranch thousands of dollars in protected livestock. But it was the small moments that changed Thomas's understanding of who they were. Watching Nala teach a young ranch hand how to read the land by feeling vibrations through the ground. Seeing Naya patiently explain to Cooper how Apache methods of water conservation could help the ranch survive the dry season. Observing both twins work with injured animals, their massive hands gentle as a mother's touch while they set broken bones or treated wounds. The other ranch hands gradually moved from suspicion to respect. It helped that the twins never flaunted their abilities or made other workers feel inferior. Instead, they shared knowledge freely, teaching anyone who wanted to learn. Within 2 weeks, half the crew had adopted Apache techniques for tracking, and several men were experimenting with the twins' methods of communicating with horses through sound and body language. Thomas found himself learning too, though what he learned went far beyond ranch skills. He discovered that Nala loved watching sunsets and could name every bird by its call. He found out that Naya had a gift for mathematics and could calculate cattle weights and market values faster than men using paper and pencil. He learned that both twins had memorized dozens of medicinal plant preparations and could treat ailments that would have required a town doctor's expensive services. But mostly, he learned about their mysterious connection. One afternoon, while they were mending fence 3 miles apart, Nala suddenly stopped working and looked toward the eastern pasture. "Naya needs help," she said with absolute certainty. "Horse threw her. She is injured but not severely." Thomas rode with Nala to find Naya sitting beside a spooked mare, holding her arm at an angle that suggested a dislocated shoulder. "How did you know?" Thomas asked Nala as she began treating her sister's injury. "We always know," both twins said together. "When one hurts, both feel it. When one needs help, both know it. This is what it means to share a soul." The evenings were the strangest time. After the work was done and the crew had gone to their bunks, the 3 of them would sit together under the stars. The twins would tell stories of Apache history, of heroes and tricksters, of lessons learned from animals and weather. Thomas would share what little he knew of his own family's past, of his mother's wisdom and his father's quiet strength. And gradually, with each passing night, the boundaries between them began to blur. A hand reaching out to touch his shoulder for emphasis during a story. A moment of shared laughter that felt more intimate than words. The way both twins would sometimes look at him with expressions that held promises he wasn't sure how to accept. One night, after a particularly long day breaking new horses, Nala spoke what they'd all been thinking. "This arrangement cannot last forever, Thomas Reed. Eventually, Sheriff Dalton or someone like him will find a way to cause trouble. Eventually, the cavalry will come looking for Apache, who should be on reservations. Eventually, this peace we have found will be tested." "I know," Thomas admitted. "But for now, we have this. We have honest work, fair treatment, and each other." "Maybe that's enough." "Is it enough?" Naya asked softly. "Or is there something more you want that you are afraid to name?" Thomas met her eyes, then Nala's, seeing the same question reflected in both faces. They were offering him something beyond partnership, beyond friendship, beyond anything his upbringing had prepared him to consider. 2 souls in 2 bodies, wanting him to be part of something he barely understood but felt pulling at him like gravity. "I don't know what I want," he said honestly. "I just know that since I met you both, I've felt less alone than I have in 5 years. Whether that's enough or the beginning of something more, I guess we'll find out together." Both twins smiled, and in the starlight, Thomas could have sworn he saw them glow with something that had nothing to do with reflected light, and everything to do with the mysterious bond they shared. A bond they were slowly, carefully inviting him to join, but the peace couldn't last. 3 days later, a rider came from town with news that would shatter their careful equilibrium and force them all to face the future they'd been avoiding. The cavalry was coming, and this time they weren't making courtesy visits. They were conducting a territorial sweep. and every Native American without proper documentation was being rounded up for transport to reservations in Oklahoma. The storm they'd been building toward was finally about to break, and the unlikely alliance between a poor cowboy and two Apache twins would face its first real test. The messenger was a young cavalry private named William Hartley, barely 20 years old and visibly uncomfortable with his assignment. He'd ridden hard from the territorial garrison, and his horse was lathered with sweat when he arrived at Burke Ranch. Clayton Burke met him in the main yard, and Thomas watched from the corral where he'd been working with Nala and Naya on sorting cattle for market. "Mr. Burke," Hartley said, dismounting stiffly, "I'm here on official business from Colonel Matthias Crow. The colonel is conducting a compliance sweep of the territory under the Indian Relocation Act. All Native Americans not currently residing on designated reservation lands are to be registered and transported to Fort Sumner for processing." Burke's expression remained neutral, but Thomas saw his jaw tighten. "This is a working ranch, Private. My employees are here legally, conducting honest labor. I failed to see how federal relocation policies apply to my operation." Hartley pulled a folded document from his saddlebag and handed it to Burke. "The colonel's orders are clear, sir. Any person of Native American descent found off reservation without proper military documentation must be detained. The sweep begins in 3 days. Cooperating ranchers will be noted favorably in official reports. Those who resist or conceal native workers will face charges of obstruction and harboring fugitives." Thomas felt his blood run cold. This wasn't a request or a negotiation. It was a declaration of intent backed by military authority. He glanced at the twins, who had stopped working and were watching the exchange, with expressions that revealed nothing but masked enormous tension. Burke read the document carefully, his face darkening with each line. "This is overreach," he said finally. "These women are documented employees with legal work agreements. They're not fugitives or hostiles. They're ranch hands. With respect, sir, Apache are considered hostile by definition under current military policy. The recent raids near Silver City have put the entire territory on alert. The colonel believes that allowing any Apache to remain free creates security risks that cannot be tolerated. The raids near Silver City were conducted by renegade bands from completely different Apache nations," Burke argued. "Punishing all Native Americans for the actions of a few is the kind of injustice that creates more problems than it solves." Private Hartley looked genuinely sympathetic, but helpless. "I don't make policy, Mr. Burke. I just deliver orders. The colonel will be here with 50 mounted troopers in 3 days. I'm authorized to tell you that compliance will be noted, and the women will be processed humanely at Fort Sumner. Resistance will result in arrest for everyone involved." After Hartley rode away, Burke called Thomas and the twins into his study. The room was lined with books and maps, the workspace of a man who valued knowledge as much as cattle. Burke poured himself a whiskey but didn't offer any to his guests, respecting that the twins didn't drink alcohol. "I won't pretend this isn't serious," Burke said bluntly. "Colonel Crow has a reputation for following orders to the letter, regardless of circumstances. If he says he's conducting a sweep, he means it. And if you two are here when he arrives, you'll be taken to Fort Sumner." "What happens at Fort Sumner?" Naya asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. Burke's expression was grim. "It's a processing center for Indian relocation. In theory, you'd be documented, questioned about your tribal affiliations, and eventually sent to a reservation in Oklahoma. In practice," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "the conditions are harsh. Disease is rampant, food is scarce, and the mortality rate is significantly higher than the Army reports publicly." "It is a death camp with a polite name," Nala said flatly. "We have heard stories from survivors. Apache sent there do not return. They die of sickness, starvation, or broken hearts. This is the government's solution to the Apache problem. Make us disappear slowly enough that Eastern newspapers do not call it murder." Thomas felt rage building in his chest. "There has to be something we can do. Legal challenges, appeals to higher authorities, something. Legal challenges take months or years, Burke replied. You don't have that kind of time. As for higher authorities, the army has broad discretion in territorial matters. No judge will overrule a colonel acting under federal Indian policy. Then we run, Thomas said. Head into the mountains, find other Apache bands, disappear where the cavalry can't follow, and live as fugitives forever? Naya asked. Always running, always hiding, never safe. That is survival, but it is not living. Better than dying in a processing center, Thomas shot back. The twins exchanged one of their silent communications, and Thomas saw something pass between them that looked like resignation mixed with determination. When they turned back to face him and Burke, their expressions had changed. They were no longer ranch hands discussing employment problems. They were warriors calculating tactical options. There is a third path, Nala said slowly. More dangerous than running, more complex than hiding. It requires help from people who have reason to resist the army's overreach, and it requires creating documentation that appears legitimate even though it is not. Burke leaned forward, interested despite himself. What kind of documentation? Papers that prove we are not Apache, Naya explained. Papers that show we are Mexican citizens working legally in American territory. Papers that establish identities that cannot be easily disproven. Forgery, Burke said. You're talking about forging federal documents. We are talking about survival, using tools available to us, Nala corrected. The cavalry expects to find Apache women. If they find Mexican workers with legitimate papers, they have no cause to detain us. Thomas shook his head. It won't work. You're nearly 7 feet tall. You have Apache features. You speak Apache languages. No amount of paperwork will make people believe you're Mexican. People believe what they want to believe, Naya said. And what we need them to believe is that we are rare but not impossible. Mexican women of unusual height with mixed ancestry. Such people exist. The twins of Durango were famous throughout northern Mexico, standing 6 feet 8 inches tall and working as vaqueras on their family's ranch. If those women existed, why not others? Burke was nodding slowly, working through the logic. You'd need birth certificates from a Mexican province, travel documents explaining your presence here, employment papers from me that predate the military sweep. It would require coordination and expense. It would also require finding someone who can create convincing forgeries, Thomas added, and who can do it in less than 3 days. I know someone, Burke said quietly. Ezra Coleman runs a print shop in Roswell. He did document work during the war, discharge papers for soldiers, letters of transit, that sort of thing. Not strictly legal, but not malicious either. He helped people caught in impossible situations find ways out. Will he help us? Nala asked. For the right price and the right reasons, probably. Ezra lost his son to cavalry brutality during a peaceful protest in Kansas. He's not fond of military overreach. Burke stood and walked to his safe, pulling out a strongbox. I'll fund this operation personally. If we're going to commit forgery, we might as well do it right. The next 48 hours were a blur of frantic activity. Burke sent a trusted ranch hand to Roswell with a coded message for Ezra Coleman. Thomas worked with the twins to create believable backstories, where they were supposedly born, how they came to work at Burke Ranch, details about their fictional family in Durango. They rehearsed answers to questions the cavalry might ask, practiced speaking Spanish with Mexican accents, and studied maps so they could describe places they'd never visited. Nala and Naya proved remarkably adept at the deception, their intelligence and memory allowing them to absorb vast amounts of fabricated detail. But Thomas could see the toll it took on them emotionally. They were being asked to deny their heritage, to pretend their Apache identity didn't exist, to erase the very thing that made them who they were. On the second night, Thomas found Nala sitting alone outside the bunkhouse, staring at stars. He sat beside her without speaking, letting his presence offer comfort his words couldn't provide. We are erasing ourselves, she said finally, becoming ghosts of Apache women, wearing Mexican masks so that soldiers will not kill us. It feels like dying slowly. You're surviving, Thomas said. There's no shame in using every tool available to stay alive, but at what cost? If we succeed, we become permanently Mexican in all official records. Our children, if we have them, will never know they are Apache. Our history dies with us, our language forgotten, our traditions lost. We save our bodies, but kill our spirits. Thomas didn't have easy answers. He'd grown up poor and white, never having to hide or deny fundamental aspects of who he was. The twins were being forced to choose between physical survival and cultural extinction, and both options carried unbearable losses. Maybe there's a middle path, he said slowly. Maybe you become Mexican in documents, but remain Apache in truth. You can teach your children the old ways in private, keep the language alive in your home, practice traditions where the government can't see. It's not perfect, but perfect isn't an option anymore. Nala turned to look at him, and in the starlight her eyes glistened with unshed tears. You speak of our children as if you will be there to see them raised. As if you are part of this future we are trying to protect. Thomas felt his heart race. They'd been dancing around this topic for weeks, acknowledging the connection growing between them without naming it directly. I'd like to be, he admitted, if you'll have me. Both of you. It is not a simple thing you are offering, Nahla said softly. Our culture does not understand a woman taking two husbands, and your culture does not understand one man bound to two women. The world will judge us harshly for what we want to build together. The world's been judging me my whole life for being poor, for being idealistic, for caring about things that don't make money. I've learned that the world's judgment matters less than living with yourself. And I can live with loving two extraordinary women who happen to share one soul. What I can't live with is letting you face this alone. Before Nahla could respond, Naya emerged from the darkness like a spirit materializing. We felt you needed us, she said simply, and Thomas realized she'd sensed her sister's emotional distress from inside the bunkhouse. Both twins sat on either side of Thomas, their presence bracketing him in warmth and solidarity. For a long moment, no one spoke. They simply existed together under the vast New Mexico sky. Three people bound by choices that had seemed impossible but now felt inevitable. When this is over, Naya said quietly, when the cavalry has come and gone, and we are safe, if we are safe, we will speak plainly about what we all want. But for now, we focus on survival. We become Mexican on paper while remaining Apache in spirit. We trust each other and trust the plan, yes? Yes, Thomas and Nala said together. On the third day, Ezra Coleman arrived at Burke Ranch with a leather portfolio containing the most beautiful forgeries Thomas had ever seen. Birth certificates from Chihuahua province, dated 26 and 23 years ago for Maria and Rosa Delgado. Travel permits showing they'd entered American territory 6 months ago to seek work. Employment contracts with Burke Ranch, backdated and artificially aged to appear legitimate. Even letters of recommendation from a fictional ranch in Mexico, written in flowery Spanish and signed with official-looking seals. This is extraordinary work, Burke said, examining each document carefully. How much do I owe you? Coleman shook his head. Nothing. Consider it payment of a debt I've owed to justice for 20 years. But, Mr. Burke, if this fails, destroy these documents immediately. Forgery of federal papers carries a minimum sentence of 10 years in prison. The rest of that day was spent transforming the twins from Apache warriors into Mexican vaqueras. They changed into traditional Mexican riding clothes, embroidered blouses, wide skirts split for riding, colorful shawls. They practiced walking differently, speaking differently, even thinking differently. Nala became Maria, the more serious and responsible older sister. Naya became Rosa, slightly more playful but still hard-working and respectful. The other ranch hands were brought into the deception gradually, each man told only what he needed to know. Most were sympathetic, having grown to respect the twins over the past weeks. A few were uncomfortable with the deception, but Burke made it clear that anyone who couldn't support the effort should find employment elsewhere. No one left, Colonel Crow arrived exactly when promised, leading 50 mounted cavalry through the main gate of Burke Ranch at precisely 9 in the morning. He was a man in his late 40s, with the kind of rigid bearing that suggested he'd never questioned an order in his life. His uniform was immaculate, his expression cold and professional. "Mr. Burke," he said, dismounting with military precision, "I'm here to conduct the compliance inspection as outlined in the notice you received. I trust you've had time to prepare." "My ranch is always prepared for inspection, Colonel," Burke replied, "though I must say I find this entire exercise unnecessary. My employees are documented workers conducting legal labor. I'll be the judge of what's legal and what's necessary. I'm looking for 2 Apache women reportedly working here. Large women twins, if reports are accurate." "Where are they?" Thomas felt his pulse hammering in his ears. This was the moment everything depended on. Whether the twins could become someone else convincingly enough to fool a military officer trained to spot deception. "I employ 2 Mexican sisters," Burke said calmly. "Maria and Rosa Delgado. They're extraordinary workers, and I have all their documentation in order. Would you like to see their papers or question them directly?" Crow's eyes narrowed. "I'd like to do both." "Bring them here." Thomas watched as Nahla and Naya, as Maria and Rosa, approached from the stable where they'd been instructed to wait. They walked with subtle differences from their usual gait, their posture slightly different, their expressions carefully neutral. They'd wrapped their hair in colorful scarves and wore crosses on chains around their necks, small details that reinforced their fabricated identities. "These are your Mexican employees?" Crow asked skeptically, taking in their impressive height. "Sí, señor," Nala said in perfect Spanish-accented English. "I am Maria Delgado, and this is my sister Rosa. We come from Durango to work on this fine ranch. Is there a problem, señor?" The colonel circled them like a predator evaluating prey, his eyes searching for any detail that would contradict their story. Thomas held his breath as Crow studied their faces, their hands, their posture. This man had decades of experience identifying Native Americans trying to pass as Mexican. If anyone could see through the deception, it was him. "Your papers," Crow demanded. Burke handed over the portfolio, and the colonel examined each document with meticulous care. He held papers up to the light, checking for inconsistencies in the paper quality. He studied signatures with a magnifying glass. He even sniffed the documents, searching for artificially aged ink. The inspection lasted 15 agonizing minutes, while everyone waited in tense silence. Finally, Crow closed the portfolio and fixed Burke with a penetrating stare. "These documents appear to be in order," he said slowly, "but appearances can be deceiving. I'm going to question these women separately in Spanish to verify their stories. If there are any inconsistencies, any details that don't align, I'll know they're fraudulent." "Question us all you wish, Colonel," Naya said with just the right amount of insulted dignity. "We have nothing to hide. We are honest workers from honest families. We do not appreciate being treated like criminals simply because we are tall and strong." For the next hour, Colonel Crow conducted the most thorough interrogation Thomas had ever witnessed. He separated the twins and questioned them about details from their fabricated childhoods, the names of streets in Durango they'd supposedly grown up on, the priest at their fictional church, the layout of their imaginary family ranch. He asked about Mexican holidays, traditional foods, family customs, anything that might trip them up and expose the deception. But Nala and Naya had prepared well. Their extraordinary memories, allowing them to maintain consistency even under intense questioning. More importantly, they'd studied not just facts but culture, absorbing the subtle mannerisms and perspectives that made their Mexican personas convincing. When Crow finally admitted defeat, his expression suggested he suspected deception but couldn't prove it. "Your employees appear to be who they claim," he told Burke grudgingly. "But I'm noting in my report that Burke Ranch employs workers of suspicious origin. Future inspections will occur without warning." As the cavalry rode away, Thomas felt the tension drain from his body like water from a broken barrel. They'd done it. Through careful planning, skillful forgery, and the twins' remarkable ability to become whoever they needed to be. They'd survived the first real test, but as Burke quietly celebrated their success and the ranch hands returned to work with relieved expressions, Thomas noticed something troubling. Colonel Crow was leaving behind 2 soldiers positioned on a ridge overlooking the ranch. They weren't hiding, weren't pretending to be anything other than observers. The colonel suspected deception, and he was making it clear that the Burke ranch would be watched. The threat hadn't passed. It had simply changed form, and the game they were playing had just become infinitely more dangerous. The cavalry observers stayed on the ridge for 5 days, their silhouettes visible against the sky like vultures waiting for something to die. Clayton Burke maintained normal ranch operations, but everyone felt the weight of constant surveillance. The twins, still maintaining their Maria and Rosa personas even among the ranch hands, worked with forced normalcy, though Thomas noticed the tension in their shoulders and the way their eyes constantly tracked the watchers on the hill. On the 6th morning, the observers were gone. Thomas wanted to feel relieved, but the disappearance felt more ominous than their presence. Predators didn't abandon prey unless they'd found better hunting grounds or were preparing a different kind of attack. The answer came 3 hours later when Ben Cooper rode in hard from town, his horse blown and his face grave. "Mr. Burke, we've got a problem. Big one." Burke, Thomas, and the twins gathered in the ranch office while Cooper caught his breath and delivered news that made Thomas's blood run cold. Sheriff Dalton arrested a man last night named Miguel Ortega, claiming he was drunk and disorderly. Except Ortega swears he was completely sober and that Dalton planted evidence. Ortega's a freight hauler, works the route between here and Durango. He's lived in that town for 15 years, knows everyone, including, Cooper paused significantly, everyone Mexican who's passed through in the last decade. "They're going to make him identify us," Naya said quietly, her face draining of color. "They'll force him to say whether Maria and Rosa Delgado are real people from Durango or fabrications." "Worse than that," Cooper continued. "Colonel Crow personally visited Ortega in his cell this morning, offered him a deal, confirmed that no Delgado sisters matching your description exist in Durango, and all charges get dropped. Refused to cooperate, and he's looking at 6 months in jail plus fines that'll bankrupt his freight business." Burke slammed his fist on the desk. "This is extortion. Crow can't prove anything, so he's manufacturing evidence through coercion. Can Ortega lie for us?" Thomas asked desperately. "Tell Crow he knows the Delgado family?" Cooper shook his head. "Ortega's a decent man, but he's got a wife and 4 children who depend on his business. Crow made it clear that cooperation means freedom and obstruction means ruin. He'll tell the truth because he has no choice. And the truth is that no 7-foot-tall twin sisters named Delgado live anywhere near Durango." The room fell silent as the implications settled over them like a suffocating blanket. Their carefully constructed deception was about to collapse, not because they'd made mistakes, but because the cavalry had found a witness who could dismantle their entire fabricated history. "When does Crow expect Ortega's testimony?" Burke asked. "Court hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning at 10. Crow's calling it a verification proceeding. Once Ortega testifies that the Delgado sisters don't exist, the colonel will have legal grounds to arrest them as Apache fugitives using fraudulent documents. He might arrest all of us for conspiracy." Nahala stood and walked to the window, staring out at the ranch that had briefly felt like home. "We should leave tonight, disappear into the desert before the hearing. Is the only way to protect you all from legal consequences." "No," Thomas said firmly. "We're not splitting up. There has to be another solution." "What solution?" Naya demanded, frustration breaking through her usual composure. "We cannot change what Ortega knows. We cannot make the Delgado sisters real. We cannot fight the entire United States Army. Sometimes there are problems that cannot be solved, only survived by running, or by changing what the problem actually is," Burke said slowly, an idea forming behind his eyes. "Cooper, how well do you know Ortega?" "Pretty well. Like I said, he's a decent man. Fair in his dealings, honest about his weights and prices. Not the kind who'd normally cooperate with something like this. But he will cooperate because he has no choice, Burke mused. Unless we give him a different choice. What if someone paid off his fines, guaranteed his business wouldn't suffer, and provided ironclad legal protection for his family? Would he risk lying under oath then? Cooper looked doubtful. Maybe, but the fines alone are probably $200, and that doesn't account for lost business while this plays out. We're talking serious money, Mr. Burke. I have serious money, Burke replied. And I have something more valuable, connections. I know judges who owe me favors, lawyers who appreciate generous donations to their campaign funds, and businessmen who depend on my continued goodwill. If I make Ortega's cooperation worthwhile and protect him from retaliation, he might be willing to bend the truth. You would risk everything for us? Nahla asked, turning from the window with disbelief in her voice. Your reputation, your wealth, possibly your freedom. Why? Burke met her gaze steadily. Because 23 years ago, I was a young lieutenant who followed orders to attack an Indian village that turned out to be peaceful farmers. Women and children died because I didn't question my commanding officer's intelligence. I've lived with that guilt every day since. I can't undo the past, but I can damn sure try to do better in the present. The weight of his confession hung heavy in the room. Burke was revealing a wound he'd carried for decades, a moral injury that shaped every decision he made. Thomas understood at that moment why Burke had given them a chance when everyone else would have turned them away. He was trying to balance scales that could never truly be balanced. Even if you convince Ortega to lie, Thomas said, Crow will be suspicious. He'll dig deeper, look for other witnesses, find other ways to prove the Delgado sisters are fabrications. Then we don't just need Ortega to lie, Naya said, her strategic mind engaging with the problem. We need to create a trail of evidence so convincing that questioning it becomes more trouble than accepting it. We need people in Durango who will vouch for the Delgado family. We need records that predate our supposed arrival here. We need to build a history so detailed that investigating it fully would take months. That's impossible, Cooper protested. You're talking about coordinating multiple forgeries across hundreds of miles in less than 24 hours. Not impossible, Burke corrected. Expensive, difficult, and requiring every favor I've accumulated over 2 decades, but not impossible. I know people in Durango, merchants I've done business with, officials who appreciate discreet financial arrangements, families who remember when I helped them during hard times. If I call in every favor simultaneously and pay premium prices for immediate cooperation, we might be able to create enough corroborating evidence to make Crow's investigation collapse under its own weight. Thomas felt hope warring with disbelief. What Burke was proposing went far beyond simple forgery. He was talking about conspiracy on a massive scale, involving dozens of people across 2 territories, all coordinated in less than a day. The logistics alone seemed insurmountable, but Nahla's expression had changed from despair to calculation. We would need birth registry entries in the Durango church records, school attendance logs showing 2 unusually tall girls, medical records from a doctor who treated us for childhood illnesses, property deeds showing our family-owned land, neighbors who remember us growing up, all of which costs money and requires people willing to commit fraud for the right price, Burke acknowledged. I'm prepared to spend whatever it takes. The question is whether we can actually pull this off in time. The next 18 hours were the most intense of Thomas's life. Burke sent riders in 4 directions, carrying coded messages and substantial cash advances. He used the ranch's telegraph to contact business associates in Durango, calling in favors with carefully worded requests that never explicitly mentioned forgery, but made intentions clear. Money flowed out of Burke's accounts like water from a broken dam, bribes to officials, payments to printers, compensation for merchants who would backdate sales records. Thomas and the twins worked with Ezra Coleman, who'd returned to Burke Ranch and set up a temporary workshop in the barn. They created layers of false history, each detail reinforcing others in a web of fabrication. So complex it approached truth through sheer weight of documentation. Coleman forged letters the Delgado sisters had supposedly sent to relatives in Santa Rosa, backdated and artificially aged. He created receipts for goods they'd purchased in Durango before leaving Mexico. He even produced a worn family Bible with birth dates and baptismal information inscribed in faded ink. Meanwhile, in Durango, Burke's contacts were executing their parts of the plan. A sympathetic priest added entries to church birth registers, carefully matching the handwriting style and ink types used 26 and 23 years ago. A retired schoolteacher discovered old attendance logs that included entries for two unusually tall Delgado girls. A Dr. Burke had once saved from financial ruin produced medical records describing treatments for the sisters during their supposed childhood. The most crucial element was finding people willing to claim they knew the Delgado family personally. Burke tracked down 3 Mexican families who'd fallen on hard times and made them offers they couldn't refuse, substantial cash payments in exchange for sworn statements that they'd been neighbors of the Delgados for years. The statements were lies, but they were lies told with convincing specificity about details Burke and the twins had carefully coordinated. As dawn broke on the day of Ortega's testimony, Thomas stood with the twins outside the barn and looked at the mountain of fabricated evidence they'd created. Birth certificates, school records, medical files, property deeds, personal letters, receipts, photographs. Yes, Coleman had even produced aged photographs supposedly showing the Delgado family at various gatherings, using advanced darkroom techniques to insert the twins' faces into genuine group photos from the era. "This is either genius or insanity," Thomas said quietly. "Often there is little difference between the two," Nahla replied. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes from a sleepless night. Naya appeared equally drained, though both maintained the focused intensity of warriors preparing for battle. "If this fails," Naya said, "if even one element doesn't hold up under scrutiny, we all face prison. Burke loses everything he's built. You lose your freedom for conspiracy. We lose our lives because Apache prisoners don't survive long in military custody. Then it can't fail," Thomas said with more confidence than he felt. "We've built something so elaborate that tearing it down would require more effort than accepting it. Sometimes the biggest lies work because people assume no one would attempt something so audacious." At 9:30, they rode into town in Burke's finest carriage, a deliberate display of wealth and respectability. The twins wore expensive Mexican dresses Burke had purchased, their hair elaborately styled, their bearing proud and confident. They looked like successful vaqueras from a prosperous family, which was exactly the image they needed to project. The courthouse was packed with curious citizens, eager to witness the confrontation between Colonel Crow and the mysterious Mexican sisters. Thomas spotted Sheriff Dalton in the front row, his expression suggesting he expected to enjoy watching them exposed and arrested. Cyrus Marsh sat nearby, his predatory smile promising future revenge once the twins were in military custody. Colonel Crow entered precisely at 10 o'clock, followed by Miguel Ortega, who looked like a man being led to his own execution. The freight hauler's eyes met Burke's briefly, and some silent communication passed between them that Thomas couldn't interpret. The presiding judge was Samuel Hartford, a territorial magistrate known for being thorough but fair. He'd also accepted substantial donations from Burke over the years for various civic improvements. Though whether that would influence his judgment remained to be seen. "This is a verification hearing regarding the citizenship status of Maria and Rosa Delgado," Hartford announced. "Colonel Crow has raised questions about whether these women are who they claim to be. Mr. Ortega has been called as a witness regarding his knowledge of families in the Durango region." "Colonel, you may proceed." Crow stood and addressed Ortega directly. "Mr. Ortega, you've operated a freight business between Santa Rosa and Durango for 15 years. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir," Ortega replied, his voice barely audible. During those 15 years, you've become familiar with the families and residents of Durango. You know the major landowners, the merchants, the prominent citizens. Yes, sir, I know many people there. Have you ever heard of a family named Delgado living in or near Durango? Specifically, a family with twin daughters of exceptional height, nearly 7 feet tall. This was the moment everything depended on. Thomas held his breath as Ortega looked at the twins, then at Colonel Crow, then at the packed courtroom. The freight hauler's hands were trembling, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning temperature. Ortega began, then stopped. He looked at Judge Hartford desperately. Your Honor, I need to speak with my attorney. Crow's expression darkened. You don't need an attorney to answer a simple question. Do you or do you not know of the Delgado family? I invoke my right against self-incrimination, Ortega said suddenly. On advice of legal counsel, I decline to answer questions that might expose me to criminal liability. The courtroom erupted in confused conversation. Crow looked furious. What possible criminal liability could arise from identifying whether a family exists? Judge Hartford banged his gavel for order. Mr. Ortega, please explain your concern to the court. Your Honor, a new voice called from the back of the courtroom. A distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit pushed through the crowd. I'm Attorney Gerald Morrison from El Paso, representing Mr. Ortega in this matter. My client has legitimate concerns about being compelled to provide testimony that could expose him to charges of perjury, conspiracy, or providing false statements to federal officers. Thomas realized what Burke had done. He'd not only convinced Ortega to resist testifying, he'd hired one of the most expensive lawyers in the territory to provide legal protection for that resistance. It was a brilliant tactical move that transformed Ortega from a coerced witness into a defendant with rights. Morrison continued. My client has been threatened with imprisonment unless he provides testimony favorable to Colonel Crow's investigation. Such coercion creates an impossible situation where any statement my client makes could be construed as either perjured or obstruction. Therefore, we assert Fifth Amendment protection against self-incrimination. Crow was on his feet. This is outrageous. Your Honor, the witness is clearly being coached to avoid providing truthful testimony. Or, Morrison countered smoothly, my client is being protected from a military officer who's attempting to manufacture evidence through threats and intimidation. Unless Colonel Crow has actual proof of fraud, proof that doesn't depend on coerced testimony, this entire proceeding is a fishing expedition designed to harass Mexican citizens whose only crime is being unusually tall. Hartford looked troubled. Colonel Crow, do you have evidence beyond Mr. Ortega's potential testimony? I have suspicions based on inconsistencies. Suspicions are not evidence, Colonel. Do you have documents, witnesses, or concrete proof that the Delgado sisters are not who they claim to be? Burke's attorney stood and addressed the court. Your Honor, if I may, we have extensive documentation establishing the Delgado family's existence and history in Durango. He began producing documents from an enormous portfolio, creating stacks of papers on the table. Birth certificates, baptismal records, school attendance logs, medical files, property deeds, and sworn affidavits from multiple Durango residents who knew the family personally. Thomas watched Crow's face as the mountain of evidence grew. The colonel looked like a man watching his carefully constructed case collapse in real time. He couldn't possibly verify all these documents quickly enough to challenge them effectively, and attempting to do so would require resources and time the military wouldn't allocate for what was supposed to be a simple verification. Furthermore, Burke's attorney continued, we have 3 witnesses present in this courtroom who traveled from Durango specifically to testify about their personal knowledge of the Delgado family. They're prepared to describe in detail their interactions with Maria and Rosa Delgado over the years. 3 Mexican families stood from the gallery, the people Burke had paid to provide false testimony. They looked nervous but determined, motivated by the cash Burke had provided and the promise of future employment opportunities. Judge Hartford examined several documents, checking seals and signatures. These appear to be authentic official records from Mexican authorities. Colonel Crow, unless you can demonstrate specific evidence of fraud, I'm inclined to accept them as legitimate, Your Honor. I request a continuance to properly investigate these documents, Crow demanded. Denied? You've had ample time to prepare your case, Colonel. This court will not harass citizens based on suspicions and prejudice. Unless you can present actual evidence of fraud right now, I'm dismissing this proceeding. Crow's jaw clenched so hard, Thomas thought he might crack his teeth. This isn't over, he said, staring directly at Burke. I know what you've done here, and I will prove it. Prove what, Colonel? Burke asked mildly. That I employ Mexican citizens with proper documentation. That I hire excellent lawyers to protect my employees from military harassment. Please, investigate all you want. Every document we've presented will withstand scrutiny because they're legitimate records from legitimate sources. The lie was delivered with such absolute confidence that Thomas almost believed it himself. They'd created a fiction so elaborate and so expensive that disproving it would require more resources than any military investigation would allocate. They'd won not by proving the truth, but by making the lie too costly to challenge. As they left the courthouse, Thomas felt simultaneously exhilarated and terrified. They'd survived an impossible situation through audacity, money, and Burke's willingness to commit massive fraud. But they'd also made an enemy of Colonel Crow, a man who would never forget this humiliation. The twins were safe for now, their false identities reinforced by layers of fabricated evidence. But Thomas knew this was a temporary victory. Crow would be watching, waiting for any mistake that would give him the excuse to strike back. The storm had been delayed, not defeated, and when it finally broke, it would be devastating. 2 weeks of uneasy peace followed the courthouse victory. The twins continued working at Burke Ranch as Maria and Rosa Delgado, their Mexican personas now reinforced by seemingly unshakable documentation. Colonel Crow had withdrawn to the territorial garrison, but everyone knew he was still investigating, still searching for the crack in their armor that would justify another attempt at arrest. What they didn't know was that the real threat was coming from a completely different direction. It started with smoke on the horizon. Thomas spotted it from the northern pasture, where he'd been checking fence lines with Nala. Thick black columns rising from what looked like 3 different locations. Too widespread to be accidental, too coordinated to be natural. Apache war party, Nala said immediately, her voice tight with recognition. Traditional raiding pattern. Hit multiple targets simultaneously to divide defensive forces. This is not random violence. This is organized warfare. They rode hard back to the ranch headquarters, where chaos was already unfolding. Ranch hands were arming themselves. Burke was organizing defensive positions, and Ben Cooper was receiving frantic reports from scouts about the extent of the attacks. Henderson Ranch is burning, Cooper reported. The Wilcox homestead too? Reports of at least 20 Apache warriors moving fast through the territory, hitting isolated properties and disappearing before anyone can respond. They're using tactics we haven't seen in 5 years. Coordinated, professional, devastating. Burke looked at the twins, his expression troubled. Any chance your people are involved? Our band is scattered or dead, Naya replied. But there are other Apache groups who never stopped fighting. If they're conducting raids organized, someone with military experience is leading them. Someone who understands how to wage war against superior numbers. The answer to who that someone was came an hour later when a young ranch hand named Tommy Burke, no relation to Clayton, rode in with an arrow embedded in his saddle and terror in his eyes. They left a message, Tommy gasped, climbing down from his exhausted horse. The war leader, he spoke English, said to tell Clayton Burke that he knows about the Apache women pretending to be Mexican. Said he knows about the fraud in the courthouse. Said if Burke wants the raids to stop, he needs to surrender the traitors who deny their own people. Thomas felt ice form in his stomach. How would an Apache war leader know about the courthouse proceedings? Because someone told them, Burke said grimly. Someone who wanted to use Apache raiders to accomplish what the cavalry couldn't, getting rid of those 2 women permanently. Nala's face had gone pale. They are calling us traitors for taking Mexican names, for hiding our Apache heritage. In the eyes of some warriors, we are worse than enemies. We are betrayers who should be executed as examples. This is Crow's doing, Thomas said with sudden certainty. He couldn't arrest you legally, so he's using Apache warriors to do his dirty work. He probably sent word through his scouts about the Apache women hiding as Mexican, knowing it would enrage traditional warriors. Burke nodded slowly, pieces falling into place. It's brilliant in a twisted way. If the raiders kill you, Crow gets what he wanted without legal complications. If we defend you and people die in the process, public opinion turns against us for harboring women who brought this violence. Either way, he wins. Then we leave, Naya said firmly. We will not be the cause of innocent deaths. We walk into the desert tonight, and the raiders will follow us instead of attacking ranches. That's suicide, Thomas protested. 20 warriors will hunt you down and execute you for the crime of surviving. Better 2 deaths than 20, Nahla replied. Better we die with honor than live knowing our presence caused massacre. Before Thomas could argue further, another scout arrived with news that made the situation infinitely worse. The raiders just hit the Davis family homestead, killed both parents, took the 3 children hostage. They're saying the children will be released unharmed if the false Mexican women are delivered to them by sunset tomorrow. The ranch fell silent. Everyone understood what this meant. 3 innocent children, ages 12, 9, and 6, were being held as leverage to force Burke's hand. If he protected the twins, those children would die. If he surrendered the twins, he'd be sending them to certain execution. Burke looked like he'd aged 10 years in 10 seconds. How do we even know they have children? This could be a lie to manipulate us. The scout handed over a small bundle. Inside were 3 locks of hair, blonde, brown, and red, tied with rawhide cord. They sent proof. Said if we want to negotiate, send someone to Red Canyon at noon tomorrow. Someone alone and unarmed. It's a trap, Cooper said immediately. They'll kill whoever goes and still keep the children, or kill the children regardless, and use the meeting to ambush our forces. Another hand added. Thomas watched the twins, standing apart from the group. Their identical faces showing identical expressions of anguished guilt. They were calculating the moral mathematics of the situation. Their lives weighed against 3 children, their survival measured against innocents' blood. He knew what they were going to do before they moved. Both twins started walking toward the stable with purposeful strides, heading for horses that would carry them into the desert and toward their execution. Thomas intercepted them before they could mount. No, we're not doing this. We do not have a choice, Nahla said, her voice breaking slightly. 3 children will die if we do not surrender. How can we live with that? How can we live with letting you be murdered by warriors who think survival is betrayal? Thomas shot back. There has to be another way. What other way? Naya demanded. We have exhausted clever plans and legal tricks. Now we face simple mathematics. 2 lives for 3. The equation is clear. The equation is wrong, Burke said, joining them, because it assumes we have to play by the raiders' rules. What if we don't negotiate? What if we don't surrender? What if we attack first and rescue those children before the deadline? Cooper looked skeptical. Mr. Burke, we're talking about 20 Apache warriors in their own territory. They'll see us coming from miles away. Even if we had trained soldiers, a rescue attempt would likely result in the hostages being killed immediately. Unless they don't see us coming, Nala said slowly, her strategic mind engaging despite her emotional turmoil. Unless someone who understands Apache tactics approaches them in a way that appears non-threatening until it is too late to react. You're talking about an Apache rescue of Apache hostages, Burke said. Understanding dawning, using their own methods against them. We would need to infiltrate their camp, Locate the children and extract them while the warriors are distracted, Naya added, her voice gaining strength as the plan took shape. It would require perfect timing, absolute stealth, and someone willing to create a diversion that draws the raiders' attention completely away from the hostages. Thomas saw where this was leading. I'll be the diversion. I'll go to the noon meeting alone like they demanded. Keep them focused on me while you two get the children out. That is suicide, both twins said simultaneously. Maybe, but it's better than watching you walk into execution or letting children die. Besides, I'm expendable. You two are extraordinary. The world needs you alive more than it needs me. Nala grabbed his arm with surprising strength. You are not expendable, Thomas Reed. You are... She stopped, struggling with emotions too complex for words. You are ours. We claimed you, chose you, bound ourselves to you. We do not abandon what is ours. Then we do this together, Thomas said. All three of us. We plan, we execute, and we survive as a team. No sacrifices, no martyrs, just people who refuse to let evil win. They spent the rest of the night planning an operation that had almost no chance of success. Nala and Naya drew maps in the dirt, showing Red Canyon's layout, a steep-walled gorge with limited access points, perfect for defense, but also creating predictable patterns of guard placement and sightlines. They identified where the raiders would likely hold hostages, where sentries would be posted, and where blind spots existed in the terrain. Burke contributed resources, quality weapons, rope for scaling canyon walls, dark clothing for night movement. Cooper volunteered 6 of his best men, all experienced fighters who'd served in the army and understood military operations. The plan that emerged was audacious, desperate, and required everything to go perfectly in an environment where nothing ever went perfectly. Thomas would arrive at the meeting spot at noon as requested, appearing to surrender, but actually acting as distraction and intelligence gatherer. While he kept the raiders' attention, the twins would scale the canyon walls from the blind side, locate the hostages, and prepare them for extraction. Cooper's men would be positioned at strategic points outside the canyon, ready to provide covering fire if things went wrong. When Thomas gave a signal, a specific bird call, Nala taught him everyone would move, simultaneously in a coordinated extraction that left the raiders confused and unable to respond effectively. It was the kind of plan that looked brilliant on paper and suicidal in practice. But it was the only option that didn't involve surrender or leaving children to die. Dawn came too quickly. Thomas rode toward Red Canyon with his stomach twisted in knots and his mind cycling through everything that could go wrong. Behind him, invisible in the landscape, Burke's men moved into position. Above him, somewhere in the rocks, the twins were making their approach using skills refined over generations of Apache warfare. Red Canyon lived up to its name, red sandstone walls rising 200 feet on either side, creating a natural fortress that channeled all approaches into a single narrow entrance. Thomas rode through that entrance knowing he might never ride back out. The Apache camp was exactly where the twins predicted, centered in the widest part of the canyon with clear sightlines in all directions. 20 warriors watched Thomas approach, their weapons ready but not immediately threatening. In the center of the camp stood a man who could only be the war leader. He was older than Thomas expected, probably in his 50s, with gray streaking his long black hair and a face marked by traditional warrior scars. But his eyes were young and sharp, missing nothing as Thomas dismounted and approached on foot as instructed. "You are not the women we demanded," the war leader said in perfect English. "You are the white man who bought them at auction, the one they call Savior. I'm Thomas Reed, and I'm here to negotiate for the children's release. There is no negotiation. We want the traitors who deny their Apache blood. You bring them, we release the children. You do not bring them, the children die. This is simple." Thomas forced himself to stay calm. "Those women aren't traitors. They're survivors. They did what they had to do to stay alive in a world that wanted to kill them for being born Apache." The war leader's expression hardened. "They embraced the names of our enemies. They pretended to be Mexican, the people who enslaved our ancestors, who sold our children as servants. They disgraced their heritage for comfort and safety. This is the definition of traitor. They disgraced nothing. They adapted. That's what Apache have always done, adapted to survive. You know this. Your people have survived by being smarter and more flexible than your enemies. We survive by maintaining who we are, not by becoming who they want us to be. The war leader gestured to his warriors. Every man here has lost family to white soldiers or Mexican slavers. We fight so that our children remember they are Apache, not because it is comfortable, but because it is truth. Those women chose lies over truth. They deserved death. Thomas could hear the genuine pain beneath the anger. This wasn't just about the twins. It was about every loss this man had suffered, every compromise he'd been forced to make, every time he'd watched his culture eroded by external forces. The twins had become symbols of everything he feared. Apache who chose survival over identity. Where are the children? Thomas asked, changing tactics. I want to see them before we continue this conversation. The war leader nodded to a younger warrior who disappeared behind a large boulder and returned leading 3 terrified children. They were dirty and scared, but appeared physically unharmed. Thomas felt relief from the war with rage. Relief they were alive, rage at the fear in their eyes. You see, they live, the war leader said. For now. Where are the traitors? I need more time. They're considering... no more time. Sunset is the deadline. You have 7 hours to bring them or these children die. The war leader paused, studying Thomas with something approaching respect. You love them, these Apache women. I see it in how you speak of them. This is good. Love shows you understand they have value. But you love who they could be, not who they are choosing to become. You would be better to love women who honor their heritage. Thomas was about to respond when he heard it. The subtle whistle of an Apache bird call that didn't quite match any natural bird. The signal. The twins were in position, and it was time to act. What happened next unfolded with brutal efficiency. Thomas dropped to the ground as if shot, causing momentary confusion among the raiders. From the canyon walls, the twins descended on ropes with impossible speed, landing beside the hostages and cutting their bonds with swift knife work. Cooper's men opened fire from the canyon entrance, forcing the raiders to take cover and dividing their attention. The warriors recovered quickly, their military training evident in how they responded to the ambush. Arrows flew toward the twins' position, and several warriors charged forward to recapture the hostages. But Nala and Naya moved like shadows, shielding the children with their own bodies while fighting off attackers with a combination of traditional weapons and modern firearms. Thomas scrambled for the cover of a large rock and drew his revolver, providing covering fire as the twins began moving the children toward a narrow side passage they'd identified during planning. The war leader was shouting orders in Apache, reorganizing his scattered forces into a coherent defensive response. Then Naya went down. An arrow caught her in the upper leg, dropping her to one knee. Nala felt her sister's pain through their mysterious connection and stumbled momentarily. Thomas saw warriors converging on their position, saw the extraction falling apart in real time. He made a choice that was either heroic or insane. Rising from cover, Thomas charged directly at the war leader, firing his revolver and screaming at the top of his lungs. It was a suicidal move, designed to draw every warrior's attention away from the twins and hostages. It worked. Apache warriors turned their weapons on Thomas, arrows whistling past his head as he zigzagged toward the war leader. He managed to close the distance and tackle the older man, wrestling him to the ground in a desperate grapple. "Call them off!" Thomas shouted, pressing his gun against the war leader's chest. "The children are clear. There's no reason for more killing." The war leader looked up at him with eyes that held grudging respect. "You would die for those who are not your people?" "They are my people. Anyone I love is my people. That's all that matters." For a long moment, the war leader stared at him. Then, incredibly, he began to laugh, a sound with no humor but genuine appreciation. "You are either very brave or very stupid, white man." "Probably both," he called out in Apache, and his warriors lowered their weapons. Thomas looked up to see the twins had successfully extracted the children through the side passage, where Burke's men were waiting with horses. The hostages were safe. The twins were injured but alive. The impossible rescue had actually succeeded. The war leader pushed Thomas off him and stood, brushing dust from his clothes. "I could kill you for this trick. I should kill you, but I respect courage, even when it is foolish. Take your people and go. Take the traitor women too. But know this, they can hide behind Mexican names and white man's love, but they cannot hide from who they are. Someday they will have to choose between survival and truth. When that day comes, I hope they choose better than they have so far." Thomas backed toward the canyon entrance, his gun still trained on the war leader, but knowing he wouldn't shoot. These weren't evil men. They were desperate men, fighting for something they saw slipping away. And Thomas couldn't hate them, even though they'd nearly killed everyone he cared about. As he rode out of Red Canyon, with Cooper's men providing escort, Thomas saw the twins waiting at the rendezvous point. Naya's leg was bandaged, and both women looked exhausted. But they were alive, and the children they'd rescued were already being returned to relatives who'd thought them lost forever. "That was the most reckless thing I have ever seen," Nala said when Thomas reached them. "You could have been killed a dozen different ways. So could you," Thomas replied. "That's what families do, risk everything for each other." Both twins looked at him with expressions that held too many emotions to name. Then simultaneously, they leaned forward and kissed him, one on each cheek in a gesture that transcended culture and language. "You called us your people," Naya said softly. "You told the war leader that anyone you love is your people." "I meant it," Thomas said. "Every word." "Then it is time we speak plainly," Nahla continued. "Time we stop dancing around what we all know. Time we acknowledge what has been growing between us since the day you bought our freedom." But before they could say more, a rider appeared on the horizon, galloping hard toward them. As he drew closer, Thomas recognized one of Burke's ranch hands with panic written across his face. "Mr. Burke sent me," the hand gasped. "Colonel Crow knows about the courthouse fraud. Someone talked, one of the Mexican families Burke paid. They couldn't handle the guilt and confessed everything. Crow has arrest warrants for all of you. Forgery, conspiracy, obstruction of justice. He's coming to the ranch with 50 soldiers. You have maybe 2 hours before they arrive." The brief moment of victory evaporated. They'd survived the Apache raiders, only to face an even more dangerous threat: the full weight of United States military justice. With evidence of crimes they'd actually committed, the impossible situation had just become hopeless. And this time, there might be no clever solution to save them. The ride back to Burke Ranch felt like racing toward the edge of a cliff. Thomas pushed his horse hard, the twins keeping pace despite Naya's injured leg, while Cooper's men spread out to warn other ranch hands about the incoming military force. 2 hours wasn't enough time to run, wasn't enough time to hide, and definitely wasn't enough time to mount any kind of defense against 50 armed cavalry. When they arrived at the ranch, they found Clayton Burke standing on his porch with a whiskey glass in his hand and an expression of calm resignation on his face. Behind him, ranch hands were loading wagons with supplies and personal belongings, preparing to scatter before the arrests began. "One of the Mexican families broke," Burke said without preamble. "The Gonzalez family. Their youngest daughter got sick, needed a doctor, and the mother's guilt overwhelmed her. She went to the local priest to confess, and the priest, being a law-abiding citizen, reported it to the authorities. Can't even blame them, really. We put ordinary people in impossible positions and expected them to carry the weight of our lies. So that's it?" Thomas asked. "We just surrender? Accept prison or execution?" Burke took a long drink from his glass. "I've been thinking about that for the past hour, trying to calculate if there's any legal defense, any loophole, any technicality that might save us. And I've come to a conclusion. Sometimes you can't outrun the consequences of your choices. We committed fraud on a massive scale. We bribed officials, forged documents, and perjured ourselves in a court of law. Those are real crimes with real penalties. You did it to save lives, Nala protested. To protect people who would have died if you had not acted, which makes it morally defensible, but still illegal, Burke replied. The law doesn't care about our good intentions. Crow has evidence, witnesses, and probable cause. When he arrives with those warrants, we're all going to prison. Thomas felt desperation clawing at his chest. After everything they'd survived, everything they'd overcome, it was going to end with chains and cells. The twins would be sent to Fort Sumner's death camp. Burke would lose everything he'd built, and Thomas would spend years locked away for the crime of trying to do the right thing. There has to be something we can do, Thomas insisted. There is, a new voice said from the ranch entrance. They all turned to see Judge Samuel Hartford dismounting from his horse, accompanied by Attorney Gerald Morrison, and surprisingly, Miguel Ortega. The judge looked tired but determined as he approached the porch. I took the liberty of inviting some guests before Colonel Crow arrives, Burke said. Figured if we're going down, we might as well understand exactly how deep the hole is. Hartford climbed the porch steps and declined Burke's offer of whiskey. I spent last night reviewing the evidence Colonel Crow presented to me regarding the courthouse fraud. It's damning. Multiple witnesses confirming they were paid to provide false testimony. Documentation experts proving the Mexican records were forged, and a paper trail showing the money Burke spent to orchestrate the entire deception. So you're here to arrest us yourself? Thomas asked bitterly. I'm here to tell you that Colonel Crow has overstepped his authority in ways that may provide you with a defense, Hartford replied. The evidence he gathered was obtained through coercion and intimidation. He threatened Miguel Ortega's family to force cooperation. He pressured the Gonzalez family by threatening to deport their relatives. He conducted searches without proper warrants and seized documents without legal authorization. In his zeal to prove fraud, he committed numerous violations of territorial law. Attorney Morrison stepped forward. What Judge Hartford is saying is that while you're guilty of forgery and fraud, Colonel Crow's methods of proving that guilt may have been illegal. We can challenge the admissibility of his evidence on constitutional grounds. That might delay prosecution, but it doesn't make us innocent, Burke said. Eventually, some other investigator will build a clean case, and we'll end up in the same place. Unless, Hartford said carefully, there's another legal framework we could apply, one that transforms this from a criminal matter into a territorial, jurisdictional dispute. Thomas exchanged confused glances with the twins. What kind of framework? Hartford pulled a document from his coat. I did some research into historical precedent for cases involving Native Americans claiming false identities for survival. There's established case law from the 1850s, the Cherokee citizenship. Cases where the Supreme Court ruled that Native Americans have the right to claim alternative identities if their lives are in immediate danger from government persecution. The reasoning was that self-preservation is a natural right that supersedes legal documentation requirements. Are you saying the twins could claim legal protection for assuming false identities? Naya asked, her voice cautious with hope. I'm saying that if we can demonstrate their lives were in immediate danger from military persecution, and that the false identities were necessary for survival, then the forgery becomes legally defensible as an act of self-preservation rather than criminal fraud. Burke was nodding slowly, seeing the angle. And my involvement becomes assistance in preventing wrongful death rather than conspiracy to commit fraud. Exactly, Morrison added. We reframe the entire situation. This isn't a story about criminals deceiving the government. It's a story about citizens protecting innocent people from illegal military persecution. Colonel Crow's Indian relocation sweep had no proper legal authorization for this territory. His actions violated several treaties and exceeded his military authority. We make him the criminal, not you. Thomas felt hope stirring, but it was tempered by realism. Will that actually work in court? It might, Hartford said honestly. It's unprecedented. complicated, and would require expert legal representation throughout multiple appeals. But it's a fighting chance, which is more than you had 10 minutes ago. Miguel Ortega finally spoke up, his voice heavy with guilt. I am sorry I was not stronger when they threatened me. I should have refused to cooperate even if it meant my family suffered. My weakness helped create this situation. Your weakness was being human, Nala said gently. No one can blame a man for protecting his family. We certainly do not. The sound of approaching horses interrupted them. Thomas looked toward the road and saw the dust cloud of a large cavalry formation. Colonel Crow was arriving right on schedule, and despite Hartford's legal theories, he was coming with arrest warrants and 50 armed soldiers to enforce them. Time to see if legal theory holds up against military reality. Burke muttered. Colonel Crow rode through the ranch gate at the head of his column, his uniform immaculate and his expression triumphant. He clearly expected to find fugitives preparing to run, not a porch full of people calmly waiting for him. Clayton Burke, Crow announced formally. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery of federal documents, and obstruction of justice. Maria and Rosa Delgado, or whatever your real names are, you're under arrest for illegal use of false identities and violation of Indian relocation statutes. Thomas Reed, you're under arrest as an accessory to the aforementioned crimes. Colonel Crow, Judge Hartford interrupted, stepping forward with authority. I'm afraid I can't allow you to make those arrests, Crow's expression darkened. Judge Hartford, this is a military matter involving federal crimes. Territorial judges have no jurisdiction. Actually, I have complete jurisdiction over crimes committed within this territory, regardless of military involvement. And I've reviewed your evidence-gathering methods. I'm issuing an immediate injunction against these arrests, pending a full hearing on the legality of your investigation. An injunction? Crow sputtered. These people committed documented fraud. Fraud you documented through illegal searches, coerced testimony, and violations of constitutional protections against unlawful seizure. Your case is built on poisoned evidence, Colonel. Any competent defense attorney will have it thrown out within a week. Morrison stepped forward with a thick folder. I've prepared preliminary motions challenging every piece of evidence you've gathered. I'm also filing formal complaints against you personally for exceeding your military authority, conducting unauthorized searches, and using intimidation tactics against civilian populations. You may have wanted to arrest criminals, Colonel, but you've actually created grounds for your own court-martial. Thomas watched Crow's face cycle through disbelief, rage, and finally calculation. The colonel was smart enough to recognize when a legal trap had been sprung around him. If he proceeded with arrests despite the injunction, he'd be violating a direct order from a territorial judge. If he backed down, he'd lose face and potentially face investigation himself. This is a temporary setback, Crow said finally. I'll appeal to higher authorities, get proper authorization, and return with warrants that will withstand any legal challenge. You've bought yourselves time, nothing more. Time is all anyone ever has, Colonel, Burke replied. The question is what we do with it. As Crow and his cavalry rode away, the tension drained from everyone like air from a punctured balloon. They'd survived again, through legal maneuvering rather than physical confrontation, but survival was survival. How long do we actually have? Thomas asked Hartford, once the soldiers were gone. Months, probably. Maybe as long as a year, if we pursue every appeal and delay tactic. Crow will eventually get clean evidence and proper authorization, but by then the political landscape might have shifted. Indian policy is changing rapidly in Washington. Public opinion is starting to turn against forced relocations. What seems inevitable today might be obsolete tomorrow, or we might just be delaying the inevitable, Naya said quietly. Buying time until we face the same charges with less sympathetic judges. Hartford didn't argue because there was no honest argument to make. They'd won a temporary victory, but the fundamental problem remained. The twins were Apache in a world that wanted all Apache removed or eliminated, and no amount of legal creativity could change that reality. That evening, After all, the visitors had departed, and the ranch had settled into uneasy calm. Thomas found himself sitting by the creek with Nahla and Naya. The sunset painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson, beautiful and indifferent to human struggles. "We need to speak plainly now," Nahla said, breaking the silence. "About what happens next, about what we are to each other, about the future we may or may not have." Thomas had been dreading and anticipating this conversation in equal measure. "I'm listening." Naya took his hand, her grip warm and strong. "In Apache culture, when twins share one soul as we do, they share everything: joy, pain, love, life. When we choose a partner, we choose together because we are together. This is difficult for outsiders to understand, but it is our truth. The night after you bought our freedom," Nahla continued, taking his other hand, "we whispered to each other about wanting you, not separately but together. Not as two women competing for one man's attention, but as one soul in two bodies, offering ourselves as we truly are." Thomas felt his heart racing. "I've never known anyone like either of you, let alone both of you. I don't fully understand what you're offering, but I know I want it. Whatever form it takes, however it works, I want to be part of your lives." "Even though the world will judge harshly?" Naya asked. "Even though both Apache and white culture will condemn such an arrangement? Even though our future is uncertain and filled with danger?" "Especially because of those things," Thomas replied. "I've spent my whole life being judged for being poor, for caring about things that don't make money, for making choices that seem stupid to practical people. I'm done living by other people's rules. If loving both of you is wrong, then I'd rather be wrong than right." The twins looked at each other, one of their silent communications passing between them. Then simultaneously, they leaned forward and kissed him, not on the cheeks this time, but on the lips. A gesture that sealed a bond that had been forming since the moment he'd shouted that impossible bid at the auction. "Then we are yours," they said in unison, their voices harmonizing in that eerie way that no longer seemed strange to Thomas. "And you are ours." Three people choosing to become one family, regardless of what the world thinks. They sat by the creek as darkness fell. Three people who'd found each other through impossible circumstances and chosen to face an uncertain future together. The legal battles weren't over. The threat from Crow would eventually return. The prejudice and judgment they'd face would be constant and cruel. But they'd also discovered something powerful: that family wasn't defined by blood or convention, but by the choices people made to stand together when everything tried to push them apart. In the weeks that followed, Burke Ranch became something unprecedented in the territory. The twins worked openly as themselves, no longer hiding behind Mexican personas, but not advertising their Apache heritage either. They became known simply as Nahla and Naya, Burke's best workers and Thomas Reed's partners in all things. Some neighboring ranchers refused to do business with Burke because of it. Others quietly expressed admiration for his courage in standing against unjust policies. The legal battle dragged on exactly as Hartford predicted. Crow filed appeals and motions, while Morrison countered with delays and constitutional challenges. The case became a minor cause célèbre in Eastern newspapers, with some writers painting Burke as a criminal and others as a hero defending the oppressed. Public opinion remained divided, but it was shifting gradually toward recognition that Indian removal policies were creating more problems than they solved. Thomas and the twins built a small cabin on Burke Ranch property, creating a home that blended Apache traditions with frontier practicality. They faced whispers and stares when they went to town, but they also found unexpected allies, other people who'd suffered under rigid social conventions and admired anyone brave enough to challenge them. On a morning 6 months after the courthouse confrontation, Thomas woke to find both twins standing by the window, hands resting on bellies that had begun to swell with the early signs of pregnancy. They discovered they were pregnant within days of each other, their mysterious connection extending even to this most fundamental biological process. "Two children," Nahla said softly. Maybe 4, if both of us carry twins. Either way, Naya added, we will raise them to know they are Apache, but also to know they can be whoever they choose to be. We will teach them that survival sometimes requires adaptation, but adaptation does not mean abandonment of self. Thomas joined them at the window, looking out at the ranch that had become their unlikely sanctuary. He thought about the auction block where this had all started, about the choice he'd made to spend everything for principles he couldn't quite articulate at the time. Was it worth it? Nahla asked, reading his thoughts as she often did. Giving up everything you owned, facing arrest and condemnation, binding yourself to 2 women who brought nothing but complications into your life. Thomas put his arms around both of them, holding his improbable family close. I gave up money and possessions. What I got in return was meaning, purpose, and love. That seems like a pretty good trade to me. The legal case never reached a final verdict. Political changes in Washington led to reforms in Indian policy, and Colonel Crow was eventually transferred to a different territory. The charges remained technically active, but effectively frozen in legal limbo. Burke continued operating his ranch successfully, and Thomas became his unofficial partner, managing operations while the twins focused on horse breeding, an area where their unique abilities made them legendary throughout the territory. Their children grew up speaking Apache and English, learning both traditional skills and modern ranching techniques, understanding they carried multiple heritages and could honor all of them. They faced prejudice and curiosity in equal measure, but they also grew up secure in the knowledge that their family had fought for the right to exist exactly as they were. Years later, when people asked Thomas about the day he'd shouted that bid at the auction, he would smile and say, "Sometimes the most important choices we make are the ones that seem stupidest at the time. I gave up everything I had for people I didn't know, and somehow ended up with everything I needed." The story of the poor cowboy who saved 2 giant Apache twins became legend in the territory, told and retold until fact and myth blurred together. But the truth was simpler and more profound than any legend. 3 people had chosen each other when the world said their choice was impossible. They'd built something real from nothing but courage and commitment. They'd proven that family was defined by loyalty rather than convention, and that love, in all its complicated forms, was stronger than any law or prejudice trying to tear it apart. In a world that demanded people fit into predetermined categories, they'd created their own category. In a time that insisted on rigid rules about who could love whom, they'd written their own rules. They hadn't changed the world, but they'd changed their corner of it, and sometimes that's all anyone can do. What does it mean to truly choose your family? To stand against injustice, even when it costs you everything? To love in ways that society doesn't understand or approve? These are questions every generation must answer for itself. Thomas, Nala, and Naya answered them through actions rather than words, through loyalty rather than convenience, through courage rather than comfort. Their story reminds us that the most radical act is often the simplest, treating people with dignity regardless of their origin, loving people for who they are rather than who we want them to be, and standing firm in our principles even when the entire world says we're wrong. The Burke Ranch stands today as a historical site, and descendants of that unlikely family still work the land their ancestors refused to abandon. The story lives on, not because it was extraordinary, though it was, but because it shows what ordinary people can accomplish when they choose courage over comfort and love over fear. Sometimes the most powerful legacy is simply proving that different kinds of families can thrive, that different kinds of love deserve recognition, and that different kinds of courage can change the world one stubborn choice at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.